This is Adrian Wong. He is a pharmacist at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, a clinical pharmacy specialist. He's also one of the lead authors on a wonderful paper on artificial intelligence in pharmacy that came out just a short time ago. And so we are thrilled to have him here to share what he learned in all that. Obviously, this is a really exciting area. Artificial intelligence may turn out to be, ooh, am I frozen?
You are, but I can still hear you.
Okay, as long as you can hear me. We can get started. It's just about 8:44. Adrian, I know you have some polls, and I will help facilitate those. Again, assuming my screen comes back here. But you can feel free to get started.
Great. So assuming you can see my slides, thank you again for having me. I'll be talking about the role of artificial intelligence in pharmacy practice. And if you're expecting to become an expert at the end of this on AI, definitely not going to happen. I think by the end of this, you'll kind of understand what impact AI has, but more importantly, the limitations of AI, which I think are the most important takeaway from this presentation. So again, I'll get started. So the objectives are listed on here and we're in the agenda. On the bottom right-hand corner is a QR code to a list of references that are based on the slide number. I just find it an easier way to be able to access references while someone is talking. And we'll be able to be something that you can link to after this presentation as well. So the objectives are listed on this slide. The agenda of this part of the session is really to talk about what AI is, what role pharmacists have in AI, existing frameworks and guidance, which I'll just say are limited, implementations for AI in pharmacy, and most importantly, as I mentioned, the challenges of AI in general, but also specifically in pharmacy practice. So I'll start with some baseline questions, as David mentioned, and would encourage any participation in these. So the first one is, which of the following best reflects your knowledge of developments in AI? Have you been using it for the past 6 months, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, or greater than 5 years?
So Adrian, I'm totally frozen. Can you hear me, Adrian?
I can hear you.
Oh, good, because other than that, I'm frozen and I can't launch the poll.
Okay, no worries.
I may have to log out, log back in. So let me try that. But you can continue, although I don't see your slides.
Can anyone else see my slides? You can just type in the chat. Okay, great.
Okay, good. As long as everyone else can see them.
Okay, we'll skip ahead then, because I think the next few poll questions are more enlightening. So I have used ChatGPT. A, no, B, yes, or C, no idea what ChatGPT is. Now I'll just look at the chat to see what the responses are. So it seems like most people generally know or have used what ChatGPT is. It is a large language model, something that you've probably seen in the news or interacted with yourself. But I think we have a good variety of experience with this. The next question builds off of this. I've used ChatGPT to do the following, and you can select all that apply. A, help make my time be used more efficiently. B, develop a draft of a writing piece, such as an abstract or manuscript. C, make a clinical decision for a patient, or D, other. The bunch have selected D. Great, so some have used it for a case study, some abstracts, some have none of the above. So definitely a good range, which I think is a good part of this session where you'll kind of learn more about it. And then question 3, I believe that AI can be successfully implemented in my clinical practice within the next 6 months, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, or greater than 5 years. So some Bs, some not applicable, some D. So I'd say more longer term based on the responses, but thank you everyone for responding. So I think to first really go into the session, what is artificial intelligence or AI? It's the use of machines to really simulate human decision making, and you might have already you probably already have experience on this in your own lives. So like autocomplete in an email, text, things like that, traffic. Although it'll be dependent on live and also previous data, but kind of things that can model what can happen in the future and predict them. It is depending on the training materials, and specifically in medicine, it's all about the data. While the machine learns to problem solve for virtual real world environments, and that's what we'll be talking about today, and its role in pharmacy practice. So to kind of elucidate the rest of this, we'll use example of warfarin dosing. So some of you might have done this today, some of you might have done it this week, past month, past year. But just think of your last experience of warfarin dosing, inpatient, outpatient, and then think of how effective your recommendation was. Was it that you nailed the warfarin dose, the goal INR for the patient? You were a little under, a little over? And just think of all the various aspects that go into determining what your warfarin dose is for a patient. And I'll give you a few seconds to think about that, and then we'll revisit this case for the rest of this presentation. So we'll move on forward. So thinking about pharmacists and AI in general, there's a lot more data, I'd say, generally in medicine, but some of the more notable things that have talked about pharmacy and AI are the ASHP Foundation forecast, which was published last year. And they found that 37% of respondents, which are panelists from all over the country, were at least somewhat prepared to validate the safety and efficacy of AI prior to implementation, at least within the next 5 years. So not very confident with that. And I think it really pertains to what the rest of this presentation is about. In Saudi Arabia, there's a survey of 410 community pharmacists. They found that there's a middle ground of knowledge of what AI is. There's a high willingness to work with AI, but there's a lot of barriers that include lack of software, hardware, as well as cost. Potential areas for AI in pharmacy practice. I've listed some of them here. Certainly there are many others, and am currently working on a white paper on that with ACCP. But in that review paper that I wrote, we focus on some of these 4 areas, which are drug discovery and repurposing, which is something that you've probably seen with COVID, pharmacy operations, medication safety, and precision medicine. And then over the next few slides, I'll talk about some of these examples. So I mentioned COVID-19 and how drug repurposing was really used to kind of identify medications that already existed that we could use for treatment of COVID-19. Certainly, some of the more relevant ones are baricitinib and dexamethasone, which are identified via these AI models that are listed on the slide. However, certainly you should be aware of the challenges. There were a lot of medications that were identified as potential targets for COVID-19, but the actual in vivo data didn't pan out for most of these drugs, such as ivermectin, most specifically. While dosing and also pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, which is part of our expertise, a lot of it is trying to figure out if that dose that we can get into a human body is actually relevant to be able to target COVID-19. So certainly issues between animal models that are used for drug repurposing, AI models that develop these candidate drugs, and then also whether or not it pertains to the human. Some of the areas for medication safety that we evaluated. So in that review paper, we reviewed, I think, over 20,000 articles, but identified 400 that were relevant. and then selected a bunch of them that we thought were thought-provoking or could potentially be used in clinical practice. You probably know about the change in pregnancy categories, but a lot of what this review paper did was try to identify what we could do for congenital medication harm, because we can't really randomize patients to that. We could identify risk of febrile neutropenia and certain oncology medications, and then also identify medication errors, adverse drug reactions via social media, which you might not think of, but since people tend to overshare, in my opinion, there's a lot of rich resources that are available, but it's really how clean the data is that allows us to determine if we can use it for patients. For pharmacy operations, orders that were placed in the inpatient setting, how likely they were to require pharmacist intervention, and therefore targeting your resources that are available to those potential problem orders instead of things that are much lower likely to cause harm, such as a bowel regimen. Determination of diagnosis so that we can easily link a medication order or prescription to a diagnosis, and therefore we might not have to call the doctor to figure out if that dose is appropriate. And then something that is near and dear to my heart is the risk of medication shortages and how we can identify medications that are at risk for shortage, but also how to mitigate these by identifying alternatives that are used in clinical practice. Finally, precision medicine is something that I think AI can really have a big impact on. There were some papers that looked at drug-resistant epilepsy and depression, and they were able to detect this 2.5 years faster than normal means, which would allow for faster changes in medications and therefore potentially better control of epilepsy. There's also some things that looked at chemotherapy responsiveness, which might be a good option to determine certain candidates for medications for oncology indications. And then also insulin dosing, including continuous glucose monitors, reducing the risk of hypoglycemia, and so on and so forth. And I see a bunch of hands. I think I'll try to take questions at the end. So the way that I think of integrating AI into medication use process, so I went through 4 different realms of medication use process, but now we'll go across the actual medication use process here. First, we have prescribing, so precision medicine and pharmacogenomics, drug-drug interactions that are clinically relevant, and also the risk of ADEs, which might clue me into choosing a different medication for a patient versus another one, or at least increasing the amount of monitoring that you would use for that patient. Prescribing, although we do use electronic prescriptions now, I talked about the use of a diagnosis, which would be able to help pharmacists determine what is an appropriate medication and dose for a certain diagnosis. And then also wrong patient orders, which is an issue in the inpatient setting and potentially an outpatient setting as well. But that might be able to clue us into identifying problem orders before they even reach the pharmacy. Regards to dispensing, if we see a prescription with unusual SIG, dosage form, dose, so on and so forth, being able to catch that before it reaches the pharmacy might be able to save us time in contacting the provider or prescriber. Administration might be able to determine the appropriate rate of infusion for medication, such as vancomycin and infusion syndrome, the appropriateness of administering a medication for a certain patient, which would be dependent on certain data. And then for monitoring, having a plan and making sure that the patient is as adherent as possible for that. Adherence to medications, which could be determined through fill history, and also identification of adverse drug events, which I think is a big missing aspect of care, where we know why patient developed hypoglycemia or developed a bleed from warfarin, but actually using that data so that we can inform our future clinical decisions is also another thing, which is ultimately what this is, where we think of medication use process as a forward process, but I think of it as a cycle where all of this data from prescribing to dispensing and monitoring should be used to determine what appropriate aspects of each of these we can do for patient care. So more of a cycle instead of a one-way process. So looking at ChatGPT, I mentioned is a large language model. You basically give it a prompt. Seems like most of you have some experience with it, but a lot of the explosion in artificial intelligence is due to the publicly available ChatGPT that you can use for various things. Most specifically, though, it is not trained specifically for medicine, although there are some that are getting closer to that and trying to make clinical decisions. I know that there's some studies that have been published that say that ChatGPT is not as accurate as a clinician's role in identifying what diagnosis there is, but they certainly are able to have some benefit in medicine, though it's not specifically trained for that. There was one study that I found last year that was by Huang and colleagues that compared basically the responses from ChatGPT versus a clinical pharmacist. They found that ChatGPT was best with drug counseling, but weaker in medication education, prescription review, adverse drug reaction recognition, and causation. So certainly, as I mentioned, not really trained for medicine, but can be good for certain things that might be able to allow for pharmacists to have more efficient care for patients and be able to broaden their scope of practice. So thinking about the role of pharmacists in AI, we've talked about a lot of the potential areas in pharmacy practice that we could implement these in. But I think it's important for us to think of as a pharmacist that we should be part of the development, given our expertise in medications, such as pharmacogenomics or clinical decision support or CDS. We should definitely review these for appropriateness and accuracy. And then when we think of implementation, which is, I think, the biggest aspect, thinking of access within our patients, but also how we actually implement these and when we should implement these. And we'll talk about that for the rest of this session. So the American Society of Health System Pharmacists in 2019 kind of produced this framework of how to integrate AI in pharmacy. They first thought it was appropriate to engage pharmacists first. We did a few polling questions that there's quite a wide range of experience of AI in this audience, which I think is great. And really trying to engage pharmacists from the beginning, even anyone in medicine, even to think of whether or not we should integrate these specific tools into our practice. We should obviously study AI, and we'll talk about some specific studies in the next few slides. Prioritize to really think of when we should implement these AI models, tools, whether or not it makes sense within our clinical practice, collaborate with other pharmacists, other disciplines to make sure that we implement these appropriately, and to most importantly, share what our findings are. And this also includes open source, so publicly available models, potentially data, although that's also an issue with privacy. So going to our first question, which of the following best reflects the potential role of AI in pharmacy practice? Do you think it's A, there are no barriers to implementation of it in clinical practice? I'm not sure if the poll is ready. B, there are multiple potential roles for it in improving patient outcomes. C, ease of generalizability allows AI to be used in all settings, including healthcare. Or D, do you think it can fully replace the full role of the pharmacist, allowing for cost savings?
Adrian, I'm sorry, which slide number is that?
This is self-assessment question 1.
I have them by slide number, like slide 22, slide 8.
I think it would have been 22 then.
There we go. Perfect. Finally. Finally, a successful slide share. Poll sharing. Great. I'll let people answer.
Great. So it seems like the majority, or 91%, think B is the correct answer, and I would agree here. The reason I don't think A is the correct answer is that there are a lot of barriers, and we'll talk a lot about them at the end of this presentation. C, I would say it's not very generalizable in most settings, and we'll talk about the limitations. And I don't think it can really fully replace the role of the pharmacist, allowing for cost savings. We did talk about what ChatGPT's data is compared to the pharmacist, but we'll talk a little bit more about what AI models have shown. Great. Thank you, everyone. So existing frameworks and guidance, and spoilers, there's not much. I mentioned ASHP, which has a statement on use of AI in pharmacy in 2020. We already talked about some of this, but it should really target appropriate tasks. So thinking of that medication use process, appropriate models, which we'll talk about limitations, as well as appropriate approach. And I think that a lot of the thought behind AI is that it's just fancy regression models, which are a way of really predicting what can happen with an outcome based on previous data. But AI uses a lot more data, it's bigger, but it's a lot messier. And that's why there's a lot of issues with making sure that an AI model is appropriate. So thinking outside of pharmacy, the journal Radiology is one of the few medical journals that really has any guidance of what to do with an AI model. And I've listed them here. That's based off of their publication 2020. But I think the things that are relevant to specifically pharmacy are that they define what data is available. They externally test it to ensure that there's generalizability. They compare it versus accepted standard. There's a benchmark or comparing to experts such as pharmacists. Demonstrate how the algorithm makes decisions, so it's not a black box. And then most importantly, and something that we found in our review, was that not many AI models have publicly available algorithms available that determine or describe how they came up with their models, or even their data, which could be de-identified. So certainly a lot of issues with AI models, and we'll talk about them in a bit. But we'll move on to self-question number 2, which I think should be slide 25 or 26, David. Which of the following best reflects the current state of AI in pharmacy practice? A, there are clear data supporting the role of the pharmacist in AI. B, there are societal guidelines on how to successfully implement AI into pharmacy practice. C, there's a need for education of the potential of AI in pharmacy. Or D, there's no role for the pharmacist in implementation of AI.
All right, I'll end that and then share the results.
Great. So the majority, or 89%, thought that C was the correct answer, and I would agree. There's really limited data, I would say, on any specific role of the pharmacist in AI, but there certainly are a lot of areas that we could help with. There's really no societal guidelines. The one that I mentioned with ASHP was just talking about what to do with AI, but not implementation. And D, obviously not correct, because I think there's a lot of areas that we can help with, which was in that flow diagram a few slides ago. So in summary for this so far, we've talked about how pharmacists can have a significant role in the implementation of AI, but there's a lot of missing data supporting that. There are growing areas of research, including drug repurposing, and how we can use these medications that already exist for new indications. But there's really, the point of this is kind of to illustrate that there's the importance of gaining knowledge in this area. There's been an explosion in the amount of literature on AI, but in the last few slides or section of this talk, we'll talk about why implementation is really lacking, which we've kind of alluded to already. So now we'll talk about 2 different areas of AI in clinical practice. One is on warfarin dosing. So going back to the example, so if you think about your last time that you dosed warfarin and what you would do or what the outcome was. And we'll talk about TRUES, which is really one of the few, it's actually a clinical trial that was implemented that actually was externally validated. And I'll talk about why that is really important. So going back to warfarin, back when I was in school and training, so dating myself a bit, there were two big trials on pharmacogenomic focused dosing of warfarin that were published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2013, UCAS and COAG, and I've talked about some of the big outcomes there. There were mixed data, and specifically in the COAG trial, there was no overall differences in time at goal range, but notably, Black patients had a decreased time and goal range despite the use of this additional data point that should increase our efficacy in warfarin dosing. The models included all these various aspects, including pharmacogenomics, polymorphisms, and this is really what the warfarindosing.org website uses to estimate the efficacy or goal initial dose of warfarin for a patient. On the website, they do describe that only 60% of the variation in warfarin dosing is explained by this model. And we'll talk about why that is important and where AI comes into this. So looking at a different population, so we have Caribbean Hispanics that use existing machine learning or ML algorithms to evaluate this underrepresented population. So we talked about the COAG trial, which evaluated that Black patients actually had worse outcomes compared to the general population, which was predominantly white. And now we have a Caribbean Hispanic underrepresented population in warfarin dosing. They tried to explain 20% of the error from the algorithm. And what they actually found was significant variability in the 12 different machine learning algorithms that they evaluated. Their time and goal range was varied from 47 to 80%. And this really illustrates that it's important to understand what goes on into a AI algorithm. If it is predominantly performed in a white population, it's not going to do well in predicting different warfarin dosing for other populations. And similarly to other clinical areas, you have to really understand what data is represented. And if it doesn't represent the population that you're taking care of, that really illustrates that you can't really use that model. So really generalizability. But I think the big thing is that there have been other studies that have looked at bias that exists in medical care. And because AI is dependent on prior data, it will learn to also have that bias, which is potentially devastating to patient care. So thinking back to your warfarin dosing, I think of warfarin dosing still as an art, still do it for some patients in the intensive care unit. But some of the things that I think of for warfarin dosing include diet and nutrition, the indication, which affects your goal INR, your response after a dose, after 2, after 3, the polymorphisms, past medical history, age, INR, and drug-drug interactions. But a lot of these challenges are because a lot of this isn't really fed into our electronic health record. So if we think of integration within the electronic health record, we have diet and nutrition, which is commonly not integrated into our areas within the EHR. You get an order for someone's diet, but you don't actually know what they eat. They might have a big kale salad. They might eat a potato, which are all sources of vitamin K. Past medical history is typically in ICD codes. Pharmacogenomics is something that might not even be possible to be integrated into your health system if you don't even have it available for certain patients. Indication is typically put in at least somewhere for a warfarin order, at least in my health system. Your response, you can see the change in INR. You can see the actual INR. Age is something that's pretty much readily available within the EHR. I think the big thing from all this is that patient has all their care documented within the the EHR, but if it's not integrated, you have a lot of missing aspects. And going back to the warfarin dosing website that explains only 60%. It's because we have all this data. It's just not easily integrated into a patient's medical record, their data. We might all consider it as pharmacists in determining the warfarin dose for a patient. Unless we appropriately integrate all of this, we won't. It's going to be impossible to explain 100% of someone's variation in warfarin dosing, but we can get pretty close if we are able to identify the things that exist for a patient based on their data, but also things that are missing, such as polymorphisms, their nutrition, which can also be variable depending on the day, the week, and also the month. So thinking of AI and clinical decision support, which is the area of my research, we try to, I'm assuming that you've all had some experience with clinical decision support, inpatient, outpatient, where you get a alert for a patient based on the dose, the allergies that patient has, so on and so forth. But actually making sure that it's a clinically relevant alert to a patient is a big thing, where I'm assuming most of us bypass at least 50% of our alerts. But if we are able to integrate AI, all these data fields into our clinical decision support, so that actually comes up with an appropriate med or dosing rec, that'd be great. And just thinking of warfarin, allergies, adverse drug events, pharmacogenomics, the diet, nutrition, labs, which is all challenging, especially since we don't all have the same EHR. Patient may go between different hospitals, different doctors, different pharmacists. So it's really important to think of more how we integrate all this data for a patient until we have more data sharing, which certainly comes with its own problems. It's a lot harder for us to come up with appropriate recommendations for a patient. So this is kind of a model of what I think of as a hypothetical clinical decision support for warfarin for a patient. So we have order for apixaban, and this patient has triple positive antiphospholipid syndrome, which based on primary literature is DOACs are inferior to warfarin due to increased mortality and also increased risk of clot. They, in this specific alert, they identified this diagnosis from a hematology note in 2021. Their risk of VTE in the next year on apixaban is 20%, and then warfarin should be considered as an alternative. And here there's this caution sign, which basically says contraindicated. And then the next one would be kind of a recommendation for what warfarin dose we should use for a patient. Recommended dose for initiation for PE in 2022 is 2.5 milligrams. And this could be based on multiple data points, including pharmacogenomics, drug-drug interactions, their previous response to warfarin, so on and so forth. But we're really far removed from being able to have all this information that would be able to inform our clinical decision-making. Instead, it comes from us as clinicians, our experience with warfarin, our understanding of primary literature. But this could be a hypothetical, more patient-specific clinical decision support, which would actually be relevant to patient care, instead of one that you could just bypass because it's not clinically relevant to a patient. So how to implement AI for warfarin? We identify a model, we validate it at your institution. More importantly, we get end user feedback from the patient, the clinicians, to see if the model is actually something that we should implement. But I think the big thing is that we need to have continuous evaluation of these AI models. One, because of the risk of bias that exists because it's trained in healthcare settings that may already have existing bias, but also to make sure that there's no things that it predicts that should not be implemented, and also the autonomy of the clinician in determining what is best for a patient. So question number 3, which of the following best reflects the role of pharmacogenomics and AI for warfarin dosing? Is it A, AI reduces the variance in warfarin dosing down to 10%? B, AI has significantly more benefit than clinical factors alone. C, AI may not accurately predict warfarin dosing in all populations. And D, AI should only be used on pharmacogenomic factors. Great. So we'll end the poll there. Based on 161 responses, vast majority of you think that C is the correct answer, and I would agree with you. I'd say there's a lot of limitations with how AI can actually reduce the variance in warfarin dosing. And based on that study that I showed you, there's a wide range from 40 to 80%. The AI does not have significantly more benefit than clinical factors alone. As I mentioned in that study as well, the warfarin dosing website can explain 60% of the variance. And then pharmacogenomics, based on the studies in New England Journal of Medicine, were variable outcomes that were mixed on predicting time at goal range. So TRUES is important for us to know about, mainly because it's a very basically the only successfully implemented AI model, in my opinion. It was a machine learning based clinical decision support for early identification of sepsis in the inpatient setting. And they tried to have a sensitivity of 80%. There's a visual flag for a patient within the EHR, which is designed on feedback, which I think is really important. And they evaluated acceptance of alert within 3 hours of that alert being fired and sent to the clinician. What they found was significant reductions in inpatient mortality, as well as hospital length of stay. I've listed the various data there. But the more important thing about TRUES, I think, is that certainly it was a randomized controlled trial, is also externally validated in other centers outside of where it originated. But there was another paper that really looked at how they successfully implemented this AI model. They developed it using frontline clinician input as well as educators to ensure that everyone knew what was going on, how to use TRUES, and also feedback from the educators and frontline clinicians, having the pilot and then expanding it to other centers for the full trial as well as maintenance. And throughout this whole study period, they evaluated alert performance and also clinician response, and then fine-tuned TRUES as they went along and learned more from this AI model. This is just some of the data that looked at when clinicians dismissed an alert versus accepted it. And I think just looking at the acceptance, ED clinicians for sepsis certainly have a lot of experience with this. They diagnose a lot of sepsis because that's where a lot of these patients come from. And then also provider experience of alert. The more comfortable they became with an alert, and the more they understood that their feedback was actually accounted for, that it actually was clinically relevant, they're more likely to accept the alert. So in summary, AI is not perfect and can never be perfect. There's always going to be missing data that kind of determines what might be best for a patient. We might not know what that data is. So for example, we know that pharmacogenomics exists for warfarin, but it's not readily available. There might be other things that go on into determining what a warfarin dose is for a patient. And there's also limited data supporting successful integration of AI into medicine. I think TRUES is really the only one that has done that by first being a clinical trial, to external validation, and then also determining what was successful about it. And really, it's important for us to evaluate how AI is integrated into clinical practice. And I'd say it's years away before other successfully implemented ones come into clinical practice. And human factors is really important. So how we interact with alerts, making sure that feedback is presented and also evaluated by the AI model. And then specifically bias, and I'll talk about the limitations of AI in the last few slides. So challenges of AI in pharmacy practice. There's a lot. So this was a review paper in BMC Medicine 2019 that kind of looked at challenges in incorporating AI. And I'd say that they are all extremely relevant now. there's the AI chasm or generalizability. I talked about how for the warfarin example specifically, it performed well specifically for a general population, but looking at underrepresented or potentially populations that might have bias to them in that general population, it's really challenging to generalize a lot of these to smaller populations. And it's extremely important for you to actually look at what was the data that trained the AI tool and also what was actually implemented with that AI strategy. I mentioned the black box, which is explainability. There's a lot that goes into AI model because there's so much data that goes into training it. But there's a lot of poor literature that explains how they came up the model, who developed it, what they learned from the model, whether they got feedback from the outcomes and refined that model more, and also the lack of open source so that you can actually see what was integrated into that model. Confounders, always a problem with a lot of studies, but specifically in this regard, bias, I think is a big thing, missing data that we either know is missing or that we don't know is missing and can actually affect patient outcomes. Bias, which I've talked about in the example for Black patients, which is unfortunate, and really making sure that we evaluate how bias affects our care for patients. And I think individuals are good at identifying bias, but thinking of systematic bias, it's a lot more challenging for that to be overcome. But there certainly is a lot of important literature that is evaluating bias and how it affects patient outcomes in all the whole spectrum of healthcare. Quality reporting is also extremely important to make sure that our AI models are developed appropriately, they have limited bias, and also making sure that we have continuous feedback to make sure that they are continuously refined based on the data that we get from patient outcomes. And then ethics, I think, is a really big part where the privacy of this data for patients, HIPAA, the World Health Organization has also published on this a few weeks ago, but thinking of how we protect patients, the data that we use from them, how we use the data, and how insurance can potentially change their coverage of patients, I think is an extremely important area that is growing literature. So just some challenges of incorporating AI that are listed on this slide. ASHP had an ethical framework specifically for pharmacy, where we think of the ultimate purpose, which is the patient, making sure that we understand the validity of the methods that are used for development of the AI model, the viability, especially making sure that's actually clinically relevant to patient care. We think of the whole patient, so insurance status, social determinants of health, things like that, where certainly challenging to integrate into our clinical decision-making. We are great at it with the individual patient, but thinking of how we actually determine at a systematic level how we use these AI models is extremely important. And then value. So making sure that we appropriately use these AI models, they're sustainable, they actually impact patient care positively. I think are some big aspects specifically in pharmacy, and I think we do a great job on that on a daily basis. But thinking of patients that you don't care for specifically at their bedside, you don't interact with on a regular basis, how we can more improve patient care across the entire healthcare spectrum, the nation, rural, underserved areas, underrepresented populations, I think are really big areas where, as a pharmacist, we have a significant role in. So thinking of AI and me, so you probably heard of how AI is going to take over your job, not just specifically in pharmacy, but physicians as well. Radiology, which is probably the biggest area of where AI models have had the most data. But there's a constantly evolving role of the pharmacist in healthcare. there's a lot of areas that we can optimize certain tasks with AI, but that would allow potentially for expanded coverage, such as rural underserved that I mentioned, increase availability of care, especially during the COVID uh, pandemic and also vaccinations. But I think really how we as pharmacists can have a role specifically in being the first and most available member of the healthcare team. AI can certainly optimize certain tasks, such as filling prescriptions, but that allows us for having more interactions with patients, which I think is extremely important, and that cannot be replaced by a machine. So the role of the human touch, making sure that patients feel that they are taken care of, their concerns are heard, and then some other aspects which there's not a lot of data on, but accountability of AI models and also law, which is variable by state for pharmacy. But specifically talking about accountability, there's a lot of how it's really not known if an AI model says that we should do something and we follow what the AI model says, and unfortunately the patient develops a negative outcome. Who's actually accountable for that decision? Is it the AI model, the developer, or is it the clinician themselves? There's a lot of areas that are still ongoing for evaluation, but I would say that certainly there's going to be growing areas of AI. But I think it can really optimize tasks that do not necessarily need our clinical expertise, but we can use our clinical expertise for more bigger impact on patient care. So in conclusion, it's really important for us as pharmacists to be aware of developments of AI. There's a lot of growing literature now, and I think it's important for you to think of, sure, there's an AI model saying that we should do something, but actually implementation of AI in clinical practice is very limited. And as I mentioned, Shrews is really the only one that I think has successfully done that. And there's really careful considerations of multiple aspects of patient care that to allow for successful implementation. And I've talked about some of the limitations. Certainly there will be growing areas of research within those, but I'm sure there will be even more areas of concern that will be growing. But I think it's just important for us to be aware that this is happening, to educate yourself. And when AI is implemented in your clinical practice, pharmacists should really be in the front line of developing them, making sure that they're accurate, and to identify what areas of improvement there are for these individual models. So that is it for my part of the presentation. I think there's some questions, and I'll try to go through them, but feel free to type them and I'll look through these. Yeah, so AI has a lot of promising aspects to pharmacy fields. Perfectionization of AI is accelerating. Who is responsible for choosing or adding information to be accessed in these AI platforms? What are the guidelines, if any, as to who judges if the information added to the system is accurate? So great question. Personally, I don't have any experience with AI at my institution, but I would assume that informatics has a lot with how determining what should be included in these AI models. Clinicians, members of the healthcare team, but I think it's really important for pharmacists to be involved, especially if it involves a medication, because there's a lot of things that go on to medication decision making that clinicians might not think of while we do. And the guidelines as to who judges if the information added to the system is accurate, there really isn't much guidance on that. I'd say it's dependent on the institution. There's some limited guidance based on professional journals such as radiology. New England Journal of Medicine Artificial Intelligence is a new journal that I think has some great thoughts of what the future of AI holds. And I've linked it in the QR code. And certainly I agree with this statement. I believe AI will add and not take away from pharmacy profession. I definitely agree with that. And I think it's important for us to stay on top of the literature and also what we can add to these models. AI has been shown to invent data and sources. Is this a risk for using in pharmacy and medicine, and how can this be mitigated? So great question. I think it's important for us to, as I mentioned, understand what goes on into an AI model. Certainly a risk, and I think it's important for anyone who implements AI into their clinical practice to actually understand what went into that AI model. Are you aware of any licensing, credentialing to be required for programming of the algorithms, either for the programmer themselves or the final product, such as FDA? Great question. There really isn't much on licensing, credentialing for who programs these algorithms. There is some guidance from the Food and Drug Administration on declaring these as like a technology or a medical product. And they actually have some guidance on this on their website. And I'll actually include that in the QR code references. But that is a great question. And some of it could be considered as a medical device because it can help with diagnostics. When do you see AI fully in play? 10 years? Also, any study on cost to medical environment and to patients out of pocket? I think it remains to be seen what happens in 10 years from now and how AI is implemented. I'm assuming there will be a lot more successful implementation of AI models, but whether or not it's pertinent to your institution, I think is one way to think about it. And I'm not aware of any study on cost of the medical environment or patients. The TRUES clinical trial didn't really talk about cost savings, but certainly something that could be evaluated as another outcome for these types of models. I think those are the questions that I've had. I think that's all that I had, and thank you everyone for attending. I think the big takeaway is really understanding the limitations of AI, but more importantly, understanding that we as clinicians, pharmacists, should really be educated and understand what goes on into developing these models and how they might be implemented in pharmacy practice. I can go, and there's one more question about the QR code. I can go back to that in the beginning. So the QR code is here, and I'll add the FDA guidance on AI models after this.
Adrian, that's wonderful. Thank you. One other question. Do you see a difference in the type of pharmacy practice? Who do you think will be impacted by AI first in the pharmacy world in terms of retail pharmacists, hospital pharmacists, different practice areas like that?
That is an excellent question. I'd probably say the community practice. There's a lot of things I think would be more easily implemented in those areas. One of the studies that I found most interesting was like pill identification, which would speed up dispensing of medications and allow for us as pharmacists to do a lot more counseling. I'd say those tests are easier than like diagnostics predicting appropriate medication dosing, and so on and so forth. But I think it certainly can be dependent on specifically on your institution, your company that you're working with, and whether or not it makes sense for them. I think it's easier to implement in the community setting, but that doesn't mean that it can be implemented in the inpatient setting as well relatively easily. I just think there's a lot of challenges in making sure that the EHR that you use can actually implement these tools in a broader sense than like an independent pharmacy that might be able to more easily implement this in a chain, for example.
Yeah.
But I don't think I have a great answer to that.
All right, wonderful. A few other things have come up in the chat.
Yeah, and there's a great point here, like use cases of ChatGPT and drafting prior auths as well. I'm speaking from my community days, that certainly was an issue. And I think using AI to draft those prior auths certainly can be a thing. But I think the other end is that there's also some data based on HMOs, insurance companies, that they also draft a response with AI as well, or they evaluate prior auths using AI. So I think it will be a challenge in how that is managed. I know that there's a lot of pushback, especially from the insurance companies on, from the community, I mean, on insurance companies using AI to evaluate prior auths.